Hello and welcome to Post-Exertional Mayonnaise. We're still on our grief topic, and this is a sort of probably part of that series, but it's so good to have Dov back with us. How have you been?
I have been crashy. I had 4 dentist appointments in 3 weeks. I don't know if that was like 2 months ago now or 1 month ago. I've
Something like that,
completely
yeah.
lost track of time and a few other things, and I've been really crashed out and spending a lot of time, most of my time in bed and in dark rooms as I do. So I guess that's
Mm,
most of my life is just being in bed in a dark room.
mm.
But I
No,
don't
but
feel like a caged tiger. Do you feel like a
yeah,
caged tiger?
sometimes I do. Yeah, like occasionally. I think I manage things quite well. It's like it's those occasions where things are really rough, and then you just want to be out in the world. Um, so yeah,
It's
but
an
yeah,
interesting. I'm thinking about that metaphor. So one of Dan's recent grief cast interviews, grief cast? No,
stories.
um,
I think I'll call it. Yeah.
one of his recent interviews was with somebody who talked about, living with ME makes them feel like a caged tiger. And then I kind of can't get that metaphor out of my head, but I also think like, I think I'm too tired I think I feel like that there are days where I feel agitated and I really mostly like when I want to go do photography stuff, like I really want to go to like the botanical garden, or like I'm a little obsessed right now with street photography. There's a lot of
Mm,
videos online where you do POV street photography where you're just people like I think wear a GoPro on their head and walk through some city or town and take photos, and then they show the photos. It's really fun, but I'm so jealous. I so want to like be able um to try to do some of that, and then I can't. So I get frustrated, but I don't know if I feel it to that level.
mm. My big thing is I'm wearing bobble hat for people that are listening on the podcast but not watching the video, and I only got this bobble hat yesterday, and I'm partly wearing it because I live in a. It's like getting cold now, and we live in a big old cold farmhouse, but and I'm sort of reluctant to put the heating on because it's so expensive, um. But yeah, I'm wearing wearing a Sunderland bobble hat with the Sunderland logo on it, my football club, and part of my grief is not being able to go to the football. And my wife actually went part of her work yesterday to the Stadium of Light, which is the stadium that my team play in, and she went for a work conference thing, and she went to the club shop when she was leaving and bought me a bobble hat. So I'm like really
Oh,
chuffed with my hat, and it was a lovely thing for her to do. But I thought it sort of fitted in with a grief theme of like that's what I miss doing. So I've got my
that's so
Sunderland bobble hat
sweet.
on now. Yeah, so I'm dead chuffed with
Love
it. I'll probably
that.
wear it all the time. Sorry.
Oh, I love that. I love that
Yeah.
story. I love the hat, and yeah, I hear you. The grief of not being able to go to sports events, not being able
Mm,
to play sports, not being able to go to events, not being able to see your team play. I forgot to write that on my list
mm,
of sort of kinds of grief,
mm,
which I guess falls under the bigger category of like grieving things that we either used to be able to do or thought we would be able to do. And
mm. Yeah.
um yeah, so many
Yeah.
kinds of grief.
Yeah.
But not all of them are symbolized by a very cute hat.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's the one thing. Yeah, and it's the one thing. A few months ago, we interviewed Alison from "I Would Be Here If I Could," and that's the place that I've nominated for the art project to go. If you haven't watched that or listened to that podcast, do go and listen to it. And progress has been made on that project for here in the UK for kind of this mirror box to appear in different places. So yeah, my nomination was the Stadium of Light at Sunderland. So at some point, this big mirror box will appear outside the stadium. Hopefully, like before or after a match, because that would be good because loads of people be able to see it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the plan for that. So yeah, it's yeah. So we've done quite a few of these grief episodes now, and it's interesting because it kind of started off something we were talking about, weren't we, Dov, as part of one of the themes that we could cover as part of the podcast generally, maybe like just do an episode on it. And it started off where I just sort of put something out on Twitter about it, and it was one of those strange ones because sometimes on Twitter you post something and hardly anybody sees it or comments, and then you post something else and it just like takes off, and like hundreds of people were looking at the post, and dozens and dozens of people were commenting on it. And I said, oh, if people want to talk about their grief experience with chronic illness, kind of get in touch. So that whittled down to about sort of 9 or 10 people that we've interviewed, and then 6 people that did audio recordings that were sent to me, which is the first episode of this mini series, and then 3 or 4. I think I've got 3 people that did something in writing. So we're going to read some of those today. So overall, we've probably had about like 20 odd people like taking part in some way or another. That's going to go out. So I think we've got another 4 or 5 episodes of those like mini interviews to go out over the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Can I ask you some questions, Dan, about
it?
Yeah,
go for it. Yeah.
So Dan has been doing all of these interviews, and he's also done some other recent interviews, which are great, with the photographer and a few artists, and in those interviews, the topic of grief often comes up, even if it's not the main topic. How has it felt for you? I mean, when you talk to other people about grief, is most of it stuff that sort of feels familiar and sounds familiar to you from your experience as well? Is it hard to do these interviews emotionally, or is it just interesting, and does it feel really meaningful? Like, I guess I'd be curious about the ways that it feels sort of meaningful to you as somebody who, like, I guess it brings up for me this sort of work we've done around the question of magical thinking and acceptance. And, we're both kind of people who think that accepting that this is, just how it's going to be for us, at least, unless, some huge medical breakthrough comes, which it doesn't seem highly likely. Does sort of grieving, do you think grieving is like part of the process of acceptance? I know I just asked you too many questions. So I guess start with the first one of, just like, how's the experience been for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because I sort of like I was saying, I almost like fell into it because it was a bit like, oh, is anybody really interested in talking about this? And there was like clearly like a really big interest in it, and way more than I was expecting. So the first week or two when it started to kind of get underway, I was like emailing lots of people, like DMing on Twitter, sort of Facebook messaging, and like trying to then schedule sort of like it sort of turned into a bit of like part-time job in a way, but I had the brain energy at the time to do it, and I was really enjoying it. But like just some of the practical sides of it, because I've spoken to people in different parts of the US and Canada. I spoke to somebody in Senegal, Spain, and then in the UK. So then trying to practically trying to arrange those different sort of like interview slot times, based on the time differences, and also kind of when different people's body systems and how they function. So some people are better in the evening, some people are better in the morning, some people are better in the afternoon. So that was interesting. So for me, it was like, yeah, trying to manage that, and then I did a few, sort of like one week and a few another week, and then and I actually got to the point where I said to a couple of people, I'm kind of not taking any more on because it's too much for me at the minute, sort of in terms of. So that was a big thing for me in terms of having to manage it and learning to say no. I can't do any more at the minute. So I really appreciate those people getting in touch, and I'm sorry I couldn't do any more. So but yeah, I think in terms of like when you say emotionally, it's been interesting. I think I've managed to sort of like compartmentalize myself, so I've not like got I've not got sort of too drawn into other people's grief, which is probably something that I learned how to manage during my social work career, I think. So my sort of social work skills are coming into place because it is really hard. Like I'm aware that I'm asking people, or have been asking people, like really tough questions, and we're sort of like digging into this topic that's really emotive as well, and it brings up different feelings for different people, and it's been tough for each person that I've spoken to, and I'm really grateful for each person that they've kind of put themselves out there, and whether it's done the audio or spoken to me in person or written in, I'm aware that that's taken like a lot of energy, emotional energy for them as well, and I really appreciate that people have kind of gone out of the way to really think about it themselves and how it's impacted them, and also wanting to share things from their own lives that are really kind of quite personal at times, as part of this sort of project. And so, yeah, I really appreciate everybody that's taken part, and yeah, being aware of people's willingness to be vulnerable as part of that, and yeah, so many themes that have come out of it, different themes of grief and what instigates the grief and what people's frustrations are. And I think one of the big things is like the loss of relationships, like loss of friendships that have just kind of disappeared. And like you said, even not talking on the grief topic, it's kind of come up in different interviews. Like when I spoke to Patricia Fortledge, the fine art photographer, that was something that she said. We weren't particularly talking about grief, but she said, the loss of friendships. And I think that seems to be like a universal theme. And then this sort of talking around the grief cycle, or the I think is it Kubler-Ross, the sort of denial, anger, acceptance. I forget them all again now. I should have researched it again. Again,
Yeah.
that's like my brain processing and trying to kind of like retain information. But yeah, that a lot of people feel anger and maybe like process it differently. But we've had some like really nice practical ways of processing that as well for different people. So that's been good. But ableism, I think, is a big thing as well. That a big theme that's come through in terms of like how people have processed, kind of thought about their anger and their grief. That actually
Like,
society
yeah,
is exclusionary
yeah.
towards people with chronic illness and ME as well, and that
So like having to grieve the fact that they don't live in a world where they're acknowledged and supported, and the sort of like the illness is much more isolating than it even needs to be for a lot of people because of ableism kind of stuff.
Yeah, and just the way that ME or energy limiting conditions are portrayed. Like we've got a real here in the UK, a real I'm trying to think what the word is. Within mainstream media, it feels, and within government, a tirade, maybe that's the right word, against people with disabilities. And the government are talking at the minute, all those news articles this week about taking free medication, free prescriptions off people with disabilities, or that people with disabilities are going to have to show what sort of spending they are. Like the government would have to have access to the bank accounts to see what they're spending in terms of like the money that's being given for benefits and things like that. Those are the things that I think cause anger at that those are examples of ableism, because it's not acknowledging the restrictions that are on us already as people with disabilities and chronic illness, and the fact that we've got to
They're basically
deal with
trying
that.
to kill us.
Yeah, as well as the grief that comes with losing everything in the first place due to loss of careers, loss of relationships, loss of just social and leisure activities, not being like the parent that you wanted to be, not being able to care for loved ones as well in the way that you'd want to. So there's so many different themes and topics that have kind of come out with it. It's been really interesting. Yeah.
When you talked about the denial, what is it? Denial, acceptance, anger, that stuff. It was interesting. One of the people was talking about how, it's not a process you ever get through. It's just something that is ongoing. And some days you're more in an acceptance mode, and some days you're more angry, and it's like, I thought that was really, I could relate to that kind of, I think that one of the things that makes it so lonely to be sick is like people expecting you to be positive, expecting you to like get better, kind of blaming you for not somehow finding a way to get better, or not like being able to just always, that this sort of toxic positivity and so not being able to kind of share with people when you're in these different modes. It's like when I'm spending time with friends who don't have ME, I'm rarely talking about grief that I'm feeling. But when I talk to people with ME, it comes up a lot. And I wonder if that's like, opening up space for people to talk about that. I think it's very lonely to not be able to talk about that with in general because some days are just, it's just going to feel really hard, like to kind of sit with the enormity of the loss, and the kinds of stresses and pressures and so I guess like opening up space for people to be able to talk about that I think, I guess it makes sense to me why a lot of people would just feel really drawn to share about it, because I'm not sure that there's enough space for that in kind of everyday life when people, when most of the pressure is around, like there's just such a lack of general empathy and understanding and care and support.
And I think, that was one of the, I've just kind of got a whole list of different things notes that I'd made, and I didn't attribute them to different people or anything, but they were just kind of different bits and bobs that came up when I've been going through. But coming to terms with the fact that this isn't going to get better is one of the things that I'd put down that somebody had said, or whether it was a tweet or whatever. But yeah, and I think that's I talked with Rachel Horton, who's a health coach, and we talked about that sort of this cyclical nature of grief, and she tied it into the seasons, which was really nice. But it was kind of like thinking about this sense that, and maybe it ties in with ableism as well, because this sense that for many people, their perception of chronic illness or sickness, I guess generally, is that you go through a phase and you go through a period of sickness, and then there's an end point, and that with chronic illness particularly, well, the chronic is, it's long term. It doesn't get better, and having to kind of like accept or try and accept that things aren't gonna necessarily, things may improve for us, or that longer term we might find that there's some treatment, but at the minute it's a chronic illness that's not going to go away. And I think people around us will sort of struggle with that fact that we're not going to get better, and it's something we have to get used to. And I spoke to Dee Savannah last night, and that episode hasn't come out yet, and it might be out in maybe a couple of weeks' time. But one of the things that she said was, we're talking about acceptance. She just said she can't accept it, the illness, but she tolerates it, and I really like that. I like that word is probably a much better word than acceptance, maybe, for a lot of us, because
Yeah.
we come to a place of tolerance where we tolerate being ill, and we kind of get used to it to an extent, but it's like hard. It's too hard to actually come to a place of acceptance. Or sometimes we might accept it, but we're always fighting against that because things change and we're kind of like progressing as people, but we're still going to be grieving the person that we were, and that sense of identity that we did have, and having to kind of find a new sense of identity.
That was
it's
one of
hard.
the top themes that came up that fascinated me, is like, I think there are some people who sort of never got the chance to fully form an adult identity before they got sick. And then there are people who, like, sort of had an identity or a sense of identity that, and we've talked about this, where Emmy just kind of takes away, like, it takes away your identity, and then you have to, and it was interesting in some of the grief discussions, people talking about, trying to rebuild, like having to kind of rebuild an identity. And I think it was you who said, like, you kind of had to rebuild your identity online. And I thought that was, I think it's really fascinating. And I think for me, that has some truth too. Like, I think, we lose access to local community, most of us, in pretty intense ways. And we also seek out the community of people who understand specifically what it's like living with ME, or what it's like living with debilitating and or disabling chronic illness. And I think a lot of our identity rebuilding sort of happens in those contexts. But yeah, the loss of identity is I think a huge point of grief for a lot of people. And then how do you go forward from there? What does it look like to sort of lose your identity, or your sense of, I don't know, identity, and then still have to go through time? I mean, I guess it's a messy process, but and it's interesting to wonder, like, do people still sort of feel like themselves, or do they feel like they had a full on personality change? Or, like, I wonder how that feels for people. I don't know. Do you kind of feel like a different person, or do you feel like the same person who's been through a lot of changes, or do none of those things sort of?
Yeah, it's interesting, because like, for me, sometimes the period, I still have like really vivid memories, and the it feels like life stopped for me, like on the 24th of January 2018, and the few months before that, like, I feel still like I've got really vivid memories, and that it doesn't feel, in some respects, doesn't feel that long ago. So when I get like Facebook sending me memories from like a year ago or 2 years ago, and it's like the same photo that I've taken a dozen times of like the same trees outside the front of the house or whatever, and it's like, oh yeah, like there's very little in terms of like my Facebook memories beyond like 2018, and that's hard, and it does feel like, yeah, life stopped in a lot of ways, but it's having to reinvent yourself a little bit somehow, and I don't know, and the only way that I have done that is online, because there's so few people that I see in real life. It's hard, isn't it? And yeah, who am I? And that's a big thing. And yeah, one of the things that that came up that somebody said was that it's particularly when your condition declines and that you can't do things, was being aware each time might be the last time that you do something. And I'm like, yeah, I'm thinking, just going back to like my football hat, the last time I went to watch my team play was like about 6 years ago now. And I took my son, and yeah, we went together, and he was like 6 or something. He's not wanted to go back since, but which is just as well, really. But yeah, it's like, will I do that again? And the person that I was in that sense. So I still support the football team, and it's still a big part of who I am. But like, will I ever get the chance to go back there and do that? And that's like quite, when you think about it like that, it's sort of like, it's really sort of scary in a way, because you think, my man, I'm like only 42. Like, is there loads of stuff in my life that I'm never going to do again? It's hard to think about it in that way, and like, I'm aware that even talking about this and talking in these ways on this podcast, for people to listen to, it's probably a hard thing to process. Like, it's quite sobering, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I think about is like, I grew up in Pennsylvania and I live in Massachusetts, and for a long time I've like, am I never going to go back to Pennsylvania again? Am I never going to get to go to the place where my grandparents lived or where I grew up, or like and I do that. One of the people you interviewed was talking about the grief of not being able to be with her mother when her mother was dying. And I think about that. I think about sort of, all the places I'm not going to get to go, and like all of the sort of big life events that I'm not going to be able to be at. And, maybe like I'll be able to attend some things via like video in some way. Maybe it depends, because it can be really hard sensory wise, but yeah, it's an enormous loss. It's just and it's and not only are we sort of, I think like in the general population outside of people with ME or people with chronic illness, it's like we're encouraged to sort of act as if we're not losing things, and to like always be thinking of better, and I think it's which kind of puts us in a place of having to find our own way with processing the loss, and yeah, and I think like for you, it's the fact that you can't go to like events with your kids, I think has been one of the really heartachy things, like not getting to go to sports events, not only like your own teams, but like taking your kids to stuff. And
well, my son started playing in a basketball league in September. He's 12, and he plays in the city, and all the matches are in the city, but he plays for his town, and that like just, that's really painful for me, not being able to go and watch him or support him in that way. And that's one of the things that I've found one of the hardest things recently, is like, he comes back and says whether they've won or lost, and if he scored or whatever like that. And it's like really, I love the fact that like, we have those little interactions when he comes home, but it's just, it like breaks my heart not being able to be there. But like, I know that if I tried to go, even if somebody else drove, in that environment, I would last like 5 minutes, because it, just the noise, the busyness, the sensory overload would just like wipe me out within 5 minutes. So I wouldn't enjoy it, and also it would just leave me wiped out for weeks afterwards, probably. So the whole thing, like, it's not worth it for me, for my health. But I'm sure my son would appreciate me being there. But it's like, how, to what extent, do we try and do things?
right.
And maybe one day I'll be able to go, but not at the minute.
There's that constant weighing of sort of that constant mathematics of like weighing the potential cost of doing an activity, and the consequences, and I think there's a way that we kind of can put pressure on ourselves, it can kind of feel like this guilt for choosing our health over things that like we really wanted to do to be with other people or support people we care about, or like a big event like your son's basketball game. That's a that's a huge event to miss. And also, like, the potential cost of going is like days or weeks of not being able to kind of engage with your kids in a meaningful daily ways. And
Yeah.
I think those are like the terrible math problems that we're
Yeah.
always having to do.
It's a trade-off, isn't it? Definitely. Yeah. I've got 3 written pieces here that people have shared. So I don't know whether I'll read 1 or 2 and just see how we get on. I'm not sure how long it would take for us to read. But yeah, it might be good to read these, and I really appreciate people sending things in. So shall I start, and then we'll just see how we get on. And if we don't get through them all, then we could come back to them
That
another
sounds
time.
great.
This is Lydia. She's a friend of mine from another life, but she recently been diagnosed with ME, and she shares her sort of like thoughts on grief here. So she says, for me, my journey with chronic illness began with chronic stress.
Do you want to read your questions that you're asking everyone, or does that not?
Yeah, I can do. They sort of fit in, but we've got, so the things I've been asking is share your chronic illness journey with us. How has grief impacted you as part of this? Things that maybe instigate grief for you and how you manage it, and then thoughts for others. So that's the kind of like template that I've been using throughout. So yeah, so she says, after 4 months of working crazy hours and feeling like my all wasn't enough, I went off sick with what felt like a virus, but wasn't COVID. It may have been a virus, but could have been burnout, stroke, ME symptoms. I had 2 months off and had the worst, most debilitating fatigue I've ever experienced, then returned to work. I then experienced some pretty awful trauma at work and lost my job. I also got COVID during this time, so ME was probably triggered by a number of things all at once for me. I'm only now coming to terms with having chronic illness and learning to manage it and look forwards, not back. How has grief impacted you as part of this? I never really thought grief was what I was experiencing when I was in the midst of the traumatic period and soon after. I was upset and hurt and angry, but grief? A therapist suggested I was grieving, but it's only recently that I've learned that grief comes in many forms and in waves as you begin to heal. I've definitely had to grieve the old me and the hobbies that I can no longer do. Dancing, swimming, walking. Going from all of it to nothing overnight was so painful, and I think I will keep having to deal with waves of grief over the things that I've lost because of my health. Grief is like an onion. You process one layer, and days or weeks down the line, another wave of grief brings a new layer to peel back. I guess I've come to see it as a positive thing and not push it away, but feel and process and let go. I obviously had grief around specific circumstances like losing my job and the loss of support, friendship, trust that comes with that. Then there's the loss of identity. I think perhaps the hardest to grieve and process, as it feels less tangible and yet more all-encompassing. Who am I if I'm no longer the Tigger-like, enthusiastic, passionate person who throws her all into life? Chronic illness steals a lot, but I am learning to focus on what I have rather than what I don't or I'm unable to do. This is a long road. In terms of what prompts the grief experience, she says, silly things can prompt grief, I find, like a health app we are encouraged to use at work that I can't access or achieve anything on because my exercise is so limited these days that it doesn't count. It is often said comparison is a thief of joy, and I think that I found that to be very true. Comparing my life now to how it was, what I could do then and that I can't now, and seeing others moving their bodies or exercising and feeling healthy and knowing I'm not able to do the same just yet triggers grief over and over again. I think the only thing I've found helpful in this is allowing myself to feel, journaling, processing with friends and other chronic illness guys who get it, and leaning in rather than away from it. Any thoughts for others She says, I'd say you are unique, as is your journey, and so will be your grief. But it matters just as every emotion does and has value. Let yourself feel and know you are enough, just as you are. Try to focus on the future and not always on the past. One step at a time, you've got this. So yeah, thanks Lydia for sharing that. There's lots of helpful things there. And I think it is like one step at a time, isn't it? And sometimes we go around in circles, don't we? Sometimes, but we can only take the step that sort of the step that we've got in front of us, I think. Yeah.
I mean, I wish there were a good metaphor for one step at a time when you're in bed.
Yeah, it's not the best. Yeah, it is. It's 1 minute at a time, almost.
Yeah,
isn't
1 minute at a time. That is often my go-to.
That
was beautiful.
So, yeah, thanks, Lydia. I've got one more. It's a bit shorter from Kirsty Roberts. She's a Twitter friend of mine. She says you can't fight grief. You might push it down deep or deny it. You might put on a happy front for those around you, but it's still there underneath. It will always find its way out in the end, somehow. It might come out as anger, depression, or hopelessness. You might take it out on yourself or friends or family, but it will seep out somehow. This time around, I chose to feel it. I took the shortcut, having passed through the storm and come out the other side. I still feel occasional unexpected waves that take me by surprise. When I sold my bicycle, when my family booked a holiday without me, when I miss important occasions, when I'm asked for my medical history, all are stark reminders of the magnitude of what I have lost. I'll allow myself these feelings for a little while. It doesn't come naturally to a people pleaser like me, but I remind myself that they are normal. They are a normal response to loss. However, life goes on in a different fashion, and I am thankful for the things that I can still enjoy. And it's important to remind myself of that too, so I can emerge from it when I'm ready. Yeah, it's that wave thing again, isn't it? Like it comes and goes, and having to kind of like sort of work through the storm of it.
I have to say that ME is quite a antidote to people pleasing.
Yeah.
It's like very hard to yeah, I really related to the kind of to what they said about people pleasing and it being hard to grieve, but it also like you don't have the fuel to kind of necessarily put on a show. And I think it takes a lot more fuel to move away from grief than it does to move towards it sometimes.
Yeah, and it's a constant sort of like coming together and coming away, isn't it? With grief, it's tough.
Yeah, well, you have to live, like you have to find a way to live, and I don't know. I think I think we all handle it differently, and I think some of us spend a lot of time there because it's like the loss is just so devastating, and you know, and yeah, I think it's really different for everyone, but I think it is I think it's really nice to get to kind of be with each other in grief. Not all the time, and not the only way to be with each other, but I think it's and it's really nice to hear as you read these. It's it makes me feel connected to people. Yeah.
I've got one more from Pamela, and I was gonna speak to Pamela as part of an interview, but in the end, she decided that she'd write something out because I think she felt it was like a bit overwhelming or didn't have the energy to have a conversation. So thanks, Pamela, for sharing, and I'll just read what you've put. Tell us about your ME journey. I always say that I developed ME after getting glandular fever when I was 16 in 1973, which is now 50 years ago. At least that is when I became aware of a before and after in my energy levels and began to recognise symptoms. That said, in retrospect, there were events prior to that which possibly contributed. In particular, from about age 11, I'd had tonsillitis every other week, and as a consequence, courses of antibiotics virtually constantly. We now know that that can wreak havoc with the immune system, and I've also read that children who have ME have often presented with recurrent tonsillitis. Anyway, for the first 20 or so years, I was knackered, but could function as long as I did nothing more than work and collapse. But since 1995, after further viral exposures, as well as other environmental and health issues, not to mention age, I've been unable to work and housebound for all but the occasional hour, about once or twice a month. Are there particular things that are most painful in having ME? Having lived a life with ME in relation to grief was a question I asked. Where do I start? There are so many things that I would have done had my body not have prevented me. Travel is the item that probably rankles most, though. I moved abroad on my own at age 35, hoping for a slower pace of life, and lived in the Canary Islands for 16 years. And I'm so glad I did that, but I would have travelled much more if I'd been able. My best friend lives in Australia, and I'd love to visit her, but I cannot even sit up for 10 minutes nowadays, let alone for a 24-hour flight. I certainly feel grief, or is it anger, for the lack of healthcare that, had it existed, might have allowed me to do more. I asked, how do you personally process grief, and is it a regular part of your life? To be honest, I don't think I do process it, but it certainly is a regular part of my life. Whilst I've been lucky as I've done some things that others haven't had the chance to do, I still feel a lot of grief for the things that I haven't been able to do. It's really a daily struggle, as something will come up that I'd like, but I can't, and then I have to deal with the disappointment and try to accept and let it go. If we take the grief cycle in relation to ME of the 5 stages. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Pamela. You've given us the denial, anger, bargaining was the one that we missed, depression and acceptance. I'd say I'm aware enough of my limitations to skip denial, go straight into anger, long since realised that bargaining is futile, will not allow myself to go into depression, but then totally struggle with acceptance. So I tend to be stuck in anger, unfortunately, which probably isn't helpful. If only I had the energy to harness it to do some good. Do you have any thoughts for others who are experiencing chronic illness over a long period? I asked. I wish I did, because I tried to take it myself. I guess the closest is to remind ourselves daily that being ill is never our fault, and that we are enough, even if all we do in a day is to convert oxygen into carbon dioxide. It's hard to keep hold of these thoughts against the tide of gaslighting around ME in particular, and the benefits cheat culture aimed at the sick and disabled in general. But I feel it's essential for relative sanity. Yeah, and the next bit was just about whether we'd have a discussion or not. So yeah, I think that's another thing that's come through, where people have been talking about, thoughts for other people, is around, actually, this isn't our fault, and like that's so
Yeah.
important to remember. And I think that's probably good, a good sort of summary and a good thing to land on, is that it's not our fault. We feel responsible for our illness, or having being ill somehow, as if we've somehow caused it to happen.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's not our fault, and
No.
that we are enough in our circumstances and what we're living through. Yeah.
Yeah, it sends me back to my first year or two with ME, where I was I think a lot of us go through a phase early on with ME where we gaslight ourselves, where we don't believe ourselves that our symptoms are real, where we think we're causing it, because I think it sort of originates in external gaslighting, or it originates in just living in a culture in which chronic illness is not acceptable or accepted. And I think, I think like there's a lot of quote wellness culture that's ends up converting into like, if you were, if you were a morally righteous person, you'd find a way to not be sick, or if if you were trying hard enough. And yeah, I think that was one of the hardest things for me to really sort of assimilate and really believe and feel to my core, is that I didn't cause this, and I'm not making this up, and this is not my fault. And we live in a culture that really wants to deny that this is a reality that can happen. And I think that in itself creates a lot of grief for a lot of people who find themselves in a situation of being sick in a way that they maybe never expected to be. And, they've been told over and over again, they've been given the message that, like, if they tried hard enough, they could get better. And yeah, that is a lie. That is not true. And yeah, it is not our fault. It is not your fault. And I think being able to hold that is allows us to start kind of, in a way, grieving and being with each other and supporting each other. But yeah, that I remember one of your interviews where someone who has had ME since, I think she said she'd had ME since 1989. And one of the last things I think she said in the interview is, people have tried to tell her this was her fault, and like how much it, how important it was for her to kind of realize that that's not true. And it's not true, but I think it's a message that's going to continue to come at us, that like one of the things we can do for each other is remind each other of that. It is not our fault, and the world wants to tell us it is.
Yeah, that's probably a good place to land and to finish. And yeah, like, it's been so good to talk to you, Dov, because we've not spoken.
So good to talk to you. It's
we've
been
not
so
spoken
long
for a while. And to have you back on the pod and back with us. So yeah.
Thanks, and thanks for all the amazing work you're doing. Please check out all the interviews Dan's been doing. They're amazing. There's so much up on the site. And comment if you can comment. Subscribe and comment if you can. That would really help us. Even if your comment is just, Dan, that hat is awesome.
Yeah, and do look out for things we've got coming up. There'll be there's like 4 or 5 more of the grief stories to come. We're going to sort of finish off the series in a couple of weeks' time. I'm talking to Emily Basilgate, who's if you look up her Substack, is Grief Sick, which she's done quite a bit of work, or is working on, kind of bringing together lots of stories around chronic illness grief, and she's done a lot of research. So I'm really excited to hear about what she's got to say. And then in December, working towards speaking to a really special guest who's going to come on. I won't say who it is yet, but I'm really looking forward to that one. And then we might take a bit of a break over December or over Christmas maybe. And then we've got a few more guests
into the Christmas and Hanukkah and whatever you celebrate, if you celebrate.
Yeah, and then we've got plans to talk to different people again in January. So it's there's lots more to come. But yeah, do subscribe if you haven't subscribed and all that stuff. And it'd be great to hear from you. Get in touch, send us an email. And thanks for watching or listening. Thanks, Dov.